Hey everyone and welcome back. Today we're diving into a question that I bet has crossed all of our minds at some point. Why is there so much suffering in the world? It's a tough one.
Absolutely, a question that has puzzled people forever.
Yeah, for ages.
Right.
Right. So to help us explore this, we're turning to this really interesting YouTube conversation I found
Oh,
between an atheist and a Muslim scholar.
interesting.
What makes this source so interesting is it's not like a typical back and forth debate.
Mhm.
You have this atheist who's really upfront about not being super familiar with Islam,
Okay.
asking some hard-hitting questions
Oh, yeah.
to this scholar.
Yeah, it's a refreshing change for sure.
So I think you'll find it makes for a pretty captivating listen as we go through this.
For sure.
So to start things off, the atheist's main point is all the suffering we see, especially when you look at the animal kingdom.
Right.
It just seems totally incompatible with this idea of a God who's all-loving. You know, like how could a God who loves everyone allow for so much pain?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people ask.
The atheist even gives this specific example, asking, why couldn't the world just run on photosynthesis?
Interesting.
You know, plants just make their own food, so animals wouldn't have to kill each other just to survive?
Makes you think.
Kind of a mind-blowing concept when you really think about it.
It is, and I think that's what makes the scholar's response so fascinating. He starts by questioning this whole idea of God being all-loving.
Oh, really? So he's basically saying our human understanding of love might not fully grasp what God's attributes are actually like.
Exactly. He argues that if we get hung up on this idea of love, we might miss other crucial parts of God, like wisdom and knowledge,
Yeah.
things that operate on a level we can't even imagine.
It's kind of like trying to understand the ocean by just looking at a single drop of water.
Perfect analogy. And to illustrate this point, the scholar actually shares this really interesting story from the Quran. It's about the prophet Moses
Okay.
and this mysterious figure named Al.
Okay, this is where it gets good.
Right. So Moses is traveling with Al, and along the way, Al does some things that just seem, well, evil. For example, they're given free passage on a ship, right?
Yeah.
They're being helped out.
Right.
But then Al goes and damages the ship, and obviously Moses is outraged.
Wait, he damages the ship that was helping them?
I know, right? It seems messed up.
Yeah.
But here's the twist. Later on, Al explains that his actions, even though they looked bad, were actually protecting the ship's owners.
Oh, wow.
Turns out there was this king who was seizing every ship that was in perfect condition.
Oh, so by damaging the ship, he actually saved it.
Exactly.
Wow, talk about a plot twist.
It really shows how what we see as bad might actually be part of a bigger plan that's ultimately good.
Right, and that we might not be able to see that at first.
Exactly. And that's the main takeaway the scholar wants us to consider. He's basically saying that we humans, with our limited view of things, we can't always see the full picture,
Makes sense.
especially with things that seem negative or bad at first glance.
You know, it's funny because we often judge situations based on how they appear to us in the moment without considering the bigger picture.
Right. It's like we're just seeing a tiny piece of a giant puzzle.
Yeah, and thinking we know what the whole picture looks like.
Yeah.
That's a really important point, especially when we're trying to make sense of why there's so much suffering in the world.
Definitely. But the scholar doesn't stop there. He also argues that evil itself is relative. Like, what's bad for one person might actually be good for someone else.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's like a different perspective on things.
So how does he explain that?
He gives some pretty relatable examples. He points out that sickness, while it's bad for the person who's sick, can actually benefit doctors.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
And he even talks about financial markets where one person's loss is often another person's gain.
I guess it's all about perspective, right?
Exactly. He's encouraging us to look beyond our own immediate experiences and consider how everything is connected. What might seem like a negative event to us might actually have positive consequences in other contexts.
So how do you think this idea of the relativity of evil changes our understanding of suffering?
Well, it definitely makes you realize that our own perspective might be limited. Maybe some things that seem totally bad actually have a positive side
That we just don't see.
that we just don't see at first.
That's a good reminder to maybe not jump to conclusions about something before we have all the facts.
Right. And maybe it can even help us appreciate the good things in our lives even more when we see that suffering can sometimes lead to something positive.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe suffering can help us grow as individuals and as a society.
That's a really insightful point, and it's something the scholar touches on as well. He points out that suffering can create opportunities for compassion and helping others. When we see someone in pain, it can awaken our empathy and motivate us to act.
So in a sense, suffering can be a catalyst for positive change.
Precisely.
That's a fascinating perspective.
It is.
But how does this scholar reconcile this idea of suffering having a purpose with this concept of a divine test?
Good question. That's actually where he goes next in this conversation. He explains that suffering is actually a key part of this divine test. He argues that if the world was all sunshine and rainbows with no bad stuff at all,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be able to truly appreciate what's good.
I never thought about it that way.
Imagine if everything was always perfect. Goodness would just become the norm.
Right. It wouldn't stand out as much.
Exactly. It wouldn't have any real meaning. And in this worldview, the afterlife is where any imbalances are corrected.
Oh, so this is where things get balanced out.
Good deeds are rewarded and evil deeds are punished.
So it's like a final reckoning.
Right, restoring a sense of justice.
So suffering on Earth, while real and painful, is temporary in the grand scheme of things.
That's how it's viewed in this framework. It's part of a larger cosmic plan.
It's a lot to consider, that's for sure.
It is.
But I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Good.
But I still have this one question. What about animals? They suffer too, but they don't have the same ideas about morality or free will as humans. How does the scholar address that?
Well, the atheist in the video brings up that exact point. And the scholar responds by explaining that animals in Islam are not subject to the same test as humans.
Oh, interesting.
He says their souls go back to the earth in the afterlife
Okay.
without being judged for their actions.
So their suffering isn't part of this test, but ours is. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around that.
It is a complex idea.
Seems a little unfair, doesn't it?
It's a question a lot of people grapple with, but the scholar adds this really interesting detail here. While animals themselves aren't judged, we can be judged for how we treat them.
Oh, really?
He gives these contrasting examples from Islamic tradition. One woman neglects a cat and is punished, while another woman helps a thirsty dog and is forgiven for her past mistakes.
Wow, those examples are powerful.
It really shows that how we treat animals does matter, even if they don't have the same spiritual standing as humans.
It's like saying our actions towards them have consequences, even if they're not being judged in the same way.
Exactly. And it raises an interesting question about our relationship with the natural world.
It does. It makes you think about our responsibilities.
Yeah.
But I still have this one big question that bugs me. If this whole universe was made for us humans, as the atheist asks in the video, why is it so vast? Like, why are there billions of galaxies out there that have nothing to do with us?
That's a great question, and the scholar's response is actually pretty funny. He points out that if the universe was actually small, atheists would probably use that as evidence against God.
It's
Like,
classic, though.
if God is so powerful, why didn't he make a bigger universe?
Exactly. It's almost like people would find a way to question it either way.
Right.
But the scholar goes on to explain that the vastness of the universe is meant to be like a testament to God's power and knowledge.
Okay. When we think about the sheer size of creation, it should make us feel small and humbled.
Like recognizing how tiny we are in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're not the center of the universe, that there are forces at play way beyond our understanding.
You know, in a way, it's almost like the universe is a giant mirror, reflecting back the limits of our knowledge.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads to the last point I want to bring up about the atheist's need for proof.
Okay.
The atheist is struggling with needing evidence to believe in God.
Makes sense. I think a lot of people can relate to that.
For sure.
We want to see it to believe it.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
But the scholar challenges this need for proof by saying that our very existence, the complexity of our bodies, the amazing way the universe works, that is the ultimate proof.
So he's saying that the miracle of life itself should be enough evidence.
Exactly. And he argues that even if you look at the Big Bang Theory, you still need something to set that Big Bang in motion, right? Where did all that energy and matter come from? And who or what organized it all?
It's like pushing the question back a step, but it doesn't really get rid of the need for some kind of creator or force behind it all.
Right. That's the core of his argument.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is.
But there's one last thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up this part of our deep dive. What about all the people who live and die without ever even hearing about God or Islam? Does the scholar have anything to say about that?
Oh, good question. And thankfully, the atheist actually brings that up, too.
Okay, good.
They ask about those who never come across the Quran or the Bible.
That always seems so unfair to me. Like, how can someone's eternal fate be decided by where they're born or what they happen to be taught?
Right. It's a question of fairness that a lot of people struggle with.
For sure.
And the scholar explains this Islamic idea of the people who the message does not reach. He says these people will be judged differently in the afterlife based on how they react to the message once it's finally revealed to them.
So they get a chance to make a choice even after death.
That's the idea, yes.
A very different way of looking at things.
Definitely. And the scholar emphasizes that God takes into account each person's circumstances, including what they knew about God during their life. It's a concept that tries to address this issue of fairness, but on a much grander scale.
I see. It's like a cosmic balancing act of sorts.
It is.
But wow, we've covered so much ground already today.
We have. It's a big topic.
From the limits of our human perspective
Yeah.
to the concept of suffering as part of a divine test.
That's a lot.
But before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to think about. If this scholar is right, and our very existence is evidence of God, how does that fit with our free will?
Oh, that's a good one.
It makes you think.
It
It
does.
really gets to the heart of the whole free will versus determinism debate.
Yeah, and we'll definitely dig into that more in part 2.
So be sure to join us for that. See you soon.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everyone. So last time, we were talking about how our very existence might be proof of God, which led us to this big question.
Right. How does that work with free will? If God already knows what I'm going to do I really have a choice? It's like, does anything I do even matter?
Exactly. It's kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it.
Yeah, it's a question that people have been debating for centuries.
So how do we even start to unpack this whole free will versus determinism thing? It seems super complicated.
Well, I think a good starting point is to understand this concept in Islam called God's omniscience.
Okay, break that down for me. What does omniscience mean?
Basically, it means that God knows everything, including the future. Like, God already knows what choices you're going to make even before you make them.
So if God already knows I'm gonna, let's say, skip the gym tomorrow morning and sleep in,
Uh-huh.
does that mean I don't really have a choice in the matter?
It's a good question, right? How can we be truly free if everything is already known?
It's kind of a paradox.
It is, and this is where the idea of predestination comes up.
Okay, I've heard that word before, but I'm honestly not sure I fully understand what it means.
It's a pretty complex theological idea.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, some interpretations of Islam suggest that God not only knows our choices, but that they are, in a way, already set.
So it's like we're following a script that's already been written.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
So do we have any control over our lives at all? Or are we just puppets?
It's a big question, and it's something a lot of people wrestle with. It can feel like it diminishes our sense of agency and responsibility.
I could see that.
But it's important to remember that not every interpretation of Islam is so rigid about predestination.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there are schools of thought that really emphasize the importance of free will.
Even though God knows everything.
Right, they argue that God might know what we're going to do, but we still have the genuine freedom to make those choices.
Okay, but how can those two ideas even work together? It seems like a contradiction to me.
It definitely is a tough concept to grasp.
For sure.
Think of it like this. Imagine that God sees all the different paths you could possibly take in life.
Okay.
Like branches on a tree, extending outwards in all directions.
Okay.
God can see where each path leads,
Yeah.
but you're the one who ultimately decides which branch to follow.
Okay, so it's like God sees all the potential endings to a movie, but we, as viewers, get to choose which ending we want to see play out.
Yeah, exactly. Our choices still matter, even if they are known in advance by a higher power.
That helps a lot, actually. It preserves some element of free will in this whole equation.
Right.
But even with all that, I still keep circling back to the question of suffering. If God knows we're going to make bad choices that lead to pain and hardship, why not just stop us? Why let us go through those painful experiences at all?
It's a valid question, and it's one that many people ask.
Like, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, why is there so much suffering, especially for people who seem to be trying their best to do good?
It's the age-old question, and honestly, there's no easy answer that's going to satisfy everyone.
Yeah.
But the scholar in this video offers some insights that might help us at least grapple with this really, really tough question.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Well, he brings us back to that idea we talked about earlier, life as a test. From an Islamic perspective, our time here on Earth is full of challenges.
Right, those trials and tribulations we were talking about.
Exactly. And it's through facing these challenges, including suffering, that we're supposed to grow.
So it's kind of like those intense workout routines that leave you sore afterwards.
Haha. Yeah, exactly.
But ultimately, they make you stronger in the long run.
Right.
So suffering is like a spiritual workout for our souls.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah.
It's not just random or meaningless. It's part of a bigger plan to refine us. That makes sense. But I can't help but wonder, couldn't we learn and grow without all the pain? Isn't there a less, painful way to become spiritually refined?
It's a fair question, and it's one that a lot of people struggle with. We naturally want to avoid pain.
Of course.
And ultimately, the answer comes down to faith.
Okay, so how does faith play into this?
The scholar seems to be saying that we have to trust that God, in his infinite wisdom, has a reason for allowing suffering.
Even if we don't understand the reason.
Even if we don't understand it, yeah. It's about having faith that there's a purpose, even when it's hidden from us.
So it's like trusting the doctor when they prescribe us a medicine that tastes terrible.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But we believe it's going to make us better in the long run.
Exactly. It's about surrendering to something bigger than ourselves, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
But doesn't that seem a bit passive? Shouldn't we be actively working to prevent suffering, to make the world a better place?
That's a great point, and it's something the scholar actually emphasizes as well. He doesn't portray suffering as something we should just accept and endure passively.
Okay.
He talks about the importance of seeking knowledge, of trying to improve ourselves, and really importantly, of helping others who are suffering.
So it's not just about enduring suffering, but about actively trying to alleviate it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have agency, even in the face of hardship.
So we have choices
Yep.
in how we respond to suffering.
Right. And those choices matter. They shape not only our own lives, but also impact the world around us.
Okay, that makes sense.
Good.
But if our existence is a test, shouldn't everyone have the same opportunities? We know that's not how it works in the real world.
It's a really important point, and one that many people struggle with.
Like, some people are born into such difficult circumstances, facing hardship from day one.
Yeah, while others seem to have it much easier.
It just doesn't seem fair.
I get it, and to be honest, this is where things get even more complicated. The scholar doesn't address this issue of unequal starting points directly in this video, but there are some concepts in Islamic teachings that might shed some light on this.
Okay, I'm all ears.
One key idea is that God's justice might not always be obvious to us.
Like, we might not see it playing out in our lifetime.
Exactly. In Islam, the afterlife is seen as the place where everything is ultimately balanced out.
Okay, so it's like a cosmic reckoning where all the injustices are finally set right.
Right. It's about having faith that even if someone endures a lifetime of hardship here,
Yeah.
they will ultimately receive their due compensation in the afterlife.
So it's like a cosmic balancing act.
Right, where everything eventually evens out.
But even with that, I can't help but wonder, is the promise of reward in the afterlife really enough to justify a lifetime of suffering? It's a tough question.
It is a really, really tough question, and honestly, there's no easy answer.
For sure.
It comes down to individual beliefs and how much trust we're willing to place in a higher power.
Even when things don't make sense to us.
Exactly.
But maybe that struggle, that wrestling match with these big questions,
Right.
maybe that's part of the journey itself.
Yeah, maybe it's not about finding all the answers,
Right.
but about seeking them honestly and openly.
That's a really good point. I feel like we could talk about this for hours.
Me too. It's such a fascinating topic.
But unfortunately, we're out of time for this part of our deep dive.
I know, you've only scratched the surface.
But don't worry, we'll be back for one last round in part 3.
Definitely.
We'll delve even deeper into this idea of free will,
Yeah.
explore this concept of divine justice,
Right.
and try to make sense of how we can reconcile faith with the very real suffering we see in the world around us.
I'm looking forward to it.
See you there. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the question of why suffering exists. As we've been going through this YouTube conversation between the atheist and the Muslim scholar, it's really made me realize just how universal this question is.
Oh, absolutely. It's something that's puzzled people for as long as we've been around.
I mean, think about it. It doesn't matter what background you come from, what you believe, or where you live. We all experience suffering at some point. and we all grapple with trying to understand it.
Right, and that's what makes this conversation so fascinating. It really gets to the heart of what it means to be human.
Exactly. And for me, one of the biggest sticking points throughout this whole discussion has been this idea of unequal starting points in life. Like, how do we make sense of the idea of a just and merciful God when some people seem to face hardship right from the moment they're born?
Yeah, it's one of the toughest things to reconcile, that's for sure. And even within Islam itself, there are a lot of different perspectives on how to understand this seeming unfairness.
So I guess my question is, even though the scholar doesn't explicitly address this issue of unequal starting points, are there any insights we can glean from this conversation that might help us grapple with this?
Well, one thing that really stuck with me was the scholar's emphasis on God's mercy.
Okay, but how does that fit in with suffering? I mean, you'd think mercy would mean the absence of pain or hardship.
Right. That's what we tend to assume, but I think the scholar is hinting at something a bit more nuanced here.
Okay, so what do you mean?
Remember when he talks about how suffering might actually serve as a way to, like, purify us or elevate our status in the afterlife?
Yeah, that whole concept of suffering as a kind of purification process.
Exactly. And while it's obviously a very difficult thing to wrap our heads around, especially when we see innocent people suffering,
Absolutely.
it does offer a different way to think about God's mercy.
So it's not necessarily about preventing suffering from happening, but about something else, something bigger that we might not be able to see.
Yeah, like maybe it's about the ultimate transformation or growth that can come from going through those tough times. Almost like sometimes the most loving act isn't to shield someone from pain, but to allow them to go through experiences that will ultimately make them stronger.
That's an interesting way to think about it. It definitely challenges the conventional way we view mercy. But even with that perspective, I still can't help but wonder, did the atheist in this conversation ever push back on this idea that suffering is somehow necessary for our spiritual development?
You know, they didn't specifically challenge that point, but I think their initial question about why the world couldn't just run on photosynthesis really speaks to their struggle with this whole concept.
Right. It's like, why can't we have spiritual growth and evolution without all the pain and suffering? Why does there have to be so much violence and hardship in the natural world?
Exactly. And I think the scholar's response to that question about how we as humans can't fully grasp the grand scheme of things is really relevant here, too. It's about trusting that there's a bigger picture at play.
A bigger picture that we might not be able to comprehend from our limited perspective?
Exactly. And it's about having faith that even though we don't understand the reasons, there is a purpose behind it all.
But that's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're in the midst of suffering yourself, or when you see people you love going through really hard times. It's natural to question why a loving God would allow that to happen.
It's totally natural to question, and I think it's important to honor those doubts and those feelings of questioning. It's part of what makes us human.
It is, but what I find really interesting about this whole conversation is that it goes beyond just offering theological explanations for suffering. It also seems to be inviting us to think about our own role in alleviating suffering.
You're so right, and those examples the scholar gives about how humans are judged for their treatment of animals, even though the animals themselves aren't being judged.
Right, the woman who neglected the cat and the woman who helped the thirsty dog, those were powerful examples.
Absolutely, and I think they were deliberately chosen to highlight this point, that even though we might not understand why suffering exists, we have a choice in how we respond to it.
We can choose to turn away, or we can choose to act with compassion and try to make a difference.
Exactly, and that's where our free will comes in. We have agency, even in the face of suffering.
It's like saying that by choosing to be kind, to help those in need, to show compassion, we're actually participating in something bigger than ourselves.
Beautifully put. And it really brings a sense of hope to what can feel like a very bleak and overwhelming topic.
It does, and it reminds us that we're not just passive observers in all of this. We have the power to make choices that can ripple outwards and create positive change.
And maybe that's the ultimate lesson here. Maybe it's not about finding all the answers to why suffering exists, but about choosing to be a force for good in the world, to alleviate suffering wherever we can.
That's a really powerful message, and it's something I think we can all carry with us, regardless of our personal beliefs.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of our deep dive.
I know, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We really have. But I hope this has sparked some new thoughts and ideas for you all listening out there. Me too. And a big thank you to the creators of that YouTube video for inspiring this deep dive.
Yes, thank you to them for such a thought-provoking conversation. And to all of you listening, Keep those conversations going. Keep asking those tough questions and keep seeking understanding.
Absolutely. And until next time, keep diving deep.